Welcome back to Dark History Files, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world. Today we're traveling back to a sweltering summer in 1863, to a small town in Pennsylvania that would become the site of the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, Gettysburg. This wasn't just another clash of armies, it was the high water mark of the Confederacy, a three-day inferno that would change the course of American history forever. So how did two massive armies, over 160,000 soldiers in total, end up converging on this quiet crossroads town? It all started with Confederate General Robert E. Lee's bold decision to invade the North for a second time. Fresh off a stunning victory at Chancellorsville, Lee was feeling confident. His Army of Northern Virginia was a seasoned, formidable fighting force. He believed that by taking the war to Union soil, he could relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia, gather much-needed supplies from the rich Pennsylvania farmland, and most importantly, deliver a knockout blow to the Union that would shatter Northern morale and possibly force President Lincoln to sue for peace. He envisioned a decisive victory that could even lead to foreign recognition of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, the Union's Army of the Potomac was in a state of flux. They were chasing Lee, but they were also dealing with a major leadership change. Just 3 days before the battle, President Lincoln replaced General Joseph Hooker with General George G. Meade. Meade, a cautious and competent but relatively unknown general, was suddenly thrust into command. Tasked with the monumental job of stopping Lee's invasion, he had to quickly get a handle on his new army and figure out Lee's intentions. All while on the move, the stage was set for a collision, but neither commander intended for it to happen at Gettysburg. It was, in many ways, an accidental battle. The whole thing kicked off on the morning of July 1st, almost by chance. A Confederate infantry brigade under General Henry Heth marched towards Gettysburg with a seemingly simple goal: to find supplies, particularly shoes, which were rumored to be in a warehouse there. But instead of shoes, they ran into 2 brigades of Union cavalry commanded by the tenacious General John Buford. Buford was a sharp, forward-thinking officer. Arriving the day before, he immediately recognized the strategic importance of the high ground south of the town, hills like Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the Round Tops. He knew that if the Union Army could hold that high ground, they would have a massive defensive advantage. So when the Confederates approached, Buford ordered his troopers to dismount and fight like infantry, forming a defensive line west of town. His goal wasn't to win a major fight, but to delay the Confederates long enough for the Union infantry, the powerful First Corps under General John Reynolds, to arrive and secure those crucial hills. For hours, Buford's outnumbered cavalrymen fought a desperate delaying action against a growing tide of Confederate soldiers. They bought precious time, and just as their lines were about to break, the Union First Corps began to arrive on the field. The battle had begun in earnest. The fighting on the first day was chaotic and brutal, swirling through the fields and ridges west and north of Gettysburg. Early on, the Union suffered a devastating blow when General Reynolds, one of their most respected commanders, was killed by a sharpshooter. Despite this loss, both sides poured more and more troops into the fray. For a while, the Union forces held their ground, particularly at a position known as the Railroad Cut. But by the afternoon, the Confederates, with superior numbers on the field, launched a massive assault. The Union 11th Corps, positioned north of town, collapsed, and the First Corps line soon followed. The Union soldiers were forced into a chaotic retreat through the streets of Gettysburg itself. It looked like a disaster for the Union, but Buford's foresight paid off. As the broken Union units streamed back through the town, they rallied on the high ground he had identified, Cemetery Hill. There, under the command of General Winfield Scott Hancock, who Meade had sent ahead to take charge, they formed a new, strong defensive line. The Confederates, exhausted and disorganized from the day's fighting, failed to press their advantage and seize the hill before nightfall. General Richard Ewell, who had taken over command of his corps after Stonewall Jackson's death, hesitated. That hesitation would prove to be a critical mistake. Day 1 ended with a Confederate victory in terms of ground gained, but the Union held the superior defensive position, a fishhook-shaped line stretching from Culp's Hill along Cemetery Ridge down to the 2 Round Tops. The second day, July 2nd, saw the fighting intensify as both armies were now almost fully assembled. General Lee was determined to dislodge the Union Army from their strong position. His plan was to launch attacks on both flanks of the Union line simultaneously. General James Longstreet, Lee's trusted old war horse, was tasked with attacking the Union left flank near the Round Tops, while General Ewell's corps would assault the right flank at Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. Lee hoped this pincer movement would crack the Union defense. However, things started to go wrong for the Confederates almost immediately. Longstreet's attack was delayed for hours as his troops took a long roundabout route to avoid being seen by Union signalmen. This delay gave the Union time to reinforce their left flank. And then, a major blunder occurred on the Union side. General Daniel Sickles, the commander of the Union Third Corps, decided on his own initiative to move his entire corps forward from their assigned position on Cemetery Ridge. He advanced to a more exposed area that included a peach orchard, a wheat field, and a rocky jumble known as the Devil's Den. Sickles thought it was better ground, but in reality he had created a salient, a bulge in the line that could be attacked from three sides, and disconnected his corps from the rest of the Union Army. When Longstreet's Confederates finally attacked in the late afternoon, they slammed right into Sickles's exposed position. What followed was some of the most savage and desperate fighting of the entire war. The peach orchard, the wheat field, and Devil's Den became horrifying vortexes of combat, changing hands multiple times. Regiments were decimated. Sickles himself had his leg shattered by a cannonball. The Union line was on the verge of collapse, but Union commanders rushed reinforcements to the scene, plugging the gaps and desperately holding on. The climax of the day's fighting on the left flank occurred at a rocky hill called Little Round Top. Due to Sickles' unauthorized move, this key position, which anchored the entire Union left, was left almost completely undefended. A Union staff officer, General Gouverneur K. Warren, spotted the impending Confederate advance from the summit and frantically sought troops to defend it. Colonel Strong Vincent rushed his brigade to the hill, arriving just moments before the Confederates. The most famous defense of Little Round Top was made by the 20th Maine, commanded by a former professor named Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Positioned on the extreme left of the entire Union Army, they repelled charge after charge. After running critically low on ammunition, Chamberlain made a split-second audacious decision. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge downhill into the exhausted attackers. The surprise and fury of the bayonet charge broke the final Confederate assault, saving the Union flank and possibly the entire battle. Meanwhile, on the other end of the line, Ewell's attacks on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill also failed to break the Union defenses. The fighting there was fierce, lasting well into the night, but the Union soldiers held their ground. By the end of the second day, the battlefield was a nightmarish landscape of death and suffering. The Union line had been battered and bent, but it had not broken. Despite the immense casualties, Meade's army still held the high ground. Lee's plan to shatter the Union flanks had failed. After the failures of Day 2, General Lee was faced with a critical decision. Some of his generals, particularly Longstreet, advised him to disengage and maneuver to a different location, to find ground that favored them. But Lee, a man of immense pride and aggressive instinct, believed his men were invincible. He felt he had come so close to victory on both days, and that one more push could break the Union center. He decided to gamble everything on a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This decision would lead to one of the most famous and tragic military actions in American history, Pickett's charge. Longstreet vehemently opposed the plan. He argued that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle could take that position. But Lee was resolute. The plan involved a massive artillery bombardment to soften up the Union center, followed by a charge of nearly 13,000 Confederate infantry across 3/4 of a mile of open, upward-sloping ground, all under the fire of Union cannons and rifles. The divisions of Generals George Pickett, Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble were chosen for the fateful assault. Around 1 p.m. on July 3rd, the Confederate cannons opened fire, beginning the largest artillery duel of the war. For nearly 2 hours, over 250 cannons thundered. shaking the very earth and shrouding the valley in a dense cloud of smoke. The Union artillery, under the command of General Henry Hunt, initially returned fire, but then cleverly ceased, to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew was coming, and to trick the Confederates into thinking the Union batteries had been destroyed. Believing the bombardment had been a success, the Confederate commanders gave the order to advance. Pickett's Virginians and the other brigades emerged from the woods on Seminary Ridge and formed a magnificent, mile-wide battle line. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. They marched forward with grim determination, dressing their lines as they went, directly into a storm of cannon fire from the Union guns that had not been silenced. Shells tore massive holes in their ranks, but the Confederates closed the gaps and kept coming. As they got closer, within rifle range, thousands of Union soldiers who had been waiting behind a low stone wall on Cemetery Ridge rose up and unleashed a devastating volley of fire. The Confederate lines began to melt away. The attackers faltered, but a small, brave group of a few hundred men, led by General Lewis Armistead, actually managed to breach the stone wall. They surged over, and for a few desperate moments it looked as if they might succeed. This was the high water mark of the Confederacy, but they were unsupported. Union reinforcements rushed in, and the Confederates were overwhelmed by a brutal counterattack of bayonets and clubbed muskets. Armistead was killed, and the survivors were captured or forced to retreat. The charge was a catastrophic failure. As the shattered remnants of the attacking force streamed back to the Confederate lines, General Lee rode out to meet them, taking the blame himself, saying, "It is all my fault. More than half of the men who made the charge were killed, wounded, or captured in less than an hour." The Battle of Gettysburg was effectively over. On July 4th, the same day that Vicksburg surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in the West, Lee's battered army began its long, sorrowful retreat back to Virginia in a torrential downpour. The Union Army, itself exhausted and having suffered immense casualties, was slow to pursue. In total, over the 3 days, there were an estimated 51,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, making Gettysburg the costliest battle of the Civil War. The Union victory was a massive turning point. It ended Lee's invasion of the North and shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded his army. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg boosted Northern morale and effectively sealed the fate of the Confederacy, though the war would still drag on for nearly 2 more brutal years. 4 months later, President Abraham Lincoln would visit the battlefield to dedicate a national cemetery. There, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a short but profoundly eloquent speech that redefined the purpose of the war, framing it not just as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a fight for a new birth of freedom and the principle that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The battle had ended, but its meaning and the sacrifices made there would echo through generations. Thanks for joining us on this journey back to Gettysburg. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to Dark History Files, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the past. See you next time.